Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, both in the audience as well as those who are with me today as our guests, to another episode of the Sunday Stream. And for the very first time, we're doing actual live rank punditry here. The polls closed just about, 2 hours ago overseas across the pond. So why not have a better time than to have three lovely Germans come on and join this American and discuss the results and what this means for Germany and its foreign policy, as that's what we do here on the Sunday Stream. So today, to give you all a brief outline of what we're going to be discussing, is that we will break down the German electoral system for those unfamiliar, the fall of Merkel, the current results as we see them, and from there discuss the politics both domestically as well as Germany's foreign policy, and we'll conclude from there. But before I get ahead of myself, I have three lovely guests with me today, and I would love for all of them to introduce themselves to you. So let's start it off.
Okay, so I'll go first. Antaios, I think it was Semigog who recommended me to you, Prude, and so we draw up this appearance here. I have a background in history, and I did some streams with Semigog on mystical and secret societies in Europe. For instance, the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, and the Freemasons in the French Revolution. This is a serial that is going to come up. And I have a background in history, but I also have a minor in public law. So I'm quite knowledgeable when it comes to international law and German constitutional law. And I think we will complement each other quite well here, Prude, because I take it that you are very familiar with politics and I can bring a legal perspective, and I'm really looking forward to the stream. I'll have to say probably you'll see EOS webcam utility here. This is because my camera just went off. Anyways, I'm glad to join you guys and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Okay, then I'll go second. I'm ST, which is just short for my YouTube handle, Structured Thoughts. I'm also on Twitter. You should definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel. My Twitter is more or less unimportant. I am an international business student by trade, and that is mostly the position that I'll be bringing in here today. So kind of Germany's foreign relations, its geopolitics. I think those are the topics that I would consider myself the most knowledgeable on. Also, my father's a documentary filmmaker, and he had to do some work on Merkel once, on to which I will draw for some points today. If you want on my YouTube channel, it's more of a revivification in the sense of older forms of thinking. And I also plan on doing history, including German history. I have a series on that. And other topics rounded about usually something in the mix of history, Catholicism, philosophy, and business and politics. So I hope to see you there, and I hope to have a nice stream right now here.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Monoftalmos. I'm a historian in training in my mid-20s from North Rhine-Westphalia. This is actually my streaming or at all YouTube debut. Generally speaking, besides, of course, to some degree, historical perspectives, I'm possibly the most tuned into German mainstream news, which I was trying to tone down in recent months anyway. Thanks in advance for having me on, and I also look highly forward to the stream.
Well, with our wonderful introductions out of the way, and thank you so much for coming on and joining me. As I said in the descriptions, three Germans walk into a bar. Stop me if you've heard this one. And with that being said, as the polls closed, I think about now 2 hours ago, based on our recent chats and on Twitter DMs, and we're just getting the results in and projections. But I think the first good place to start would, of course, be how on earth the German electoral system works, for those who don't know. I know that it was a fun time explaining it to me. I know that Antaios and I had a lovely conversation 2 days ago trying to contrast and compare it to the American system. So let's start there. I guess Antaios and Mono probably have the best background there.
Alrighty. The German electoral system is called a personalisiertes Verhältniswahlrecht, which can be translated as personalized proportional voting system. And in order to get a grasp of it, let's start with the second vote, because in these elections, you can cast 2 votes, but the second vote is really the important one, and this is also the vote that shows up in the polls. So this second vote is according to the proportional vote, which means you elect the party of your choice, and let's say the SPD gets 20% of the votes, they will get 20% of the seats in parliament. This is why it's called proportional, because unlike the voting system in the US and in the UK, it is proportional. It's not the case that the winner takes it all and all the other votes are lost. And this system is very fair. You have an every citizen has an equal vote, but there's one problem that comes with it. And this is that if you allow each party to have to be represented proportionally, then you will end up with an atomized parliament. And this was, for instance, the case during the Weimar Republic, where you had many splinter parties, and it was very difficult to form coalitions and very difficult to legislate. So this is why the German constitution has a 5% clause, which means that if any party gets less than 5% on the second vote, they won't enter the Bundestag. There are a few exceptions. For instance, the Südschleswige Wählerverbund, this is a party in the German state Schleswig-Holstein, and it's a representation of the Danish minority. And for ethnic minorities, the German constitution has made an exception where the 5% clause does not work. So with this being said, we've just talked about the second vote, so the proportional voting, but the German voting system is a mixed one because it has also elements of the Anglo-American system, majoritarian voting, and this is the first vote that people cast. And here you can elect a candidate of your choice, a person, in a given electoral district. And the effect of this is that the parties are then forced to send this person directly to parliament. And the idea is that the individual voter can influence what kind of persons are going to end up in parliament. But there is one problem with this system, because it very often happens, and it has happened during this election as well. This is the case if, for instance, a given party gets, say, 30% for the first vote, but they only get 25% on the second vote. Then there's a difference of 5%. And in this case, you have the so-called Überhangmandate, overhang mandates. And what that means is that this difference, this surplus of 5%, is added to the Bundestag, to the parliament. And this is why the Bundestag is always bigger as stipulated in the Constitution. So the Constitution talks about 598 seats. The last Bundestag had, I think, 701 seats, and this one will have round about 730 seats. But given that the equality of the vote is a constitutional principle, there's one problem with this procedure, and the problem is that small parties are disadvantaged because they are less likely to carry the first vote, to carry the district elections. And another problem is that the equality of the vote is also violated, because if you happen to vote in a person which will result in an overhang mandate, then your vote counts more than the others. So this is why the German Supreme Court decided some 10 years ago that this is unconstitutional, and then the Bundestag has changed this law. And now we have the so-called Ausgleichsmandate, the balancing mandates. So that means if a big party like the SPD or the CDU, they get like 5% extra mandates, so will all the other parties that have not profited from this. So to wrap it up, the German system is a proportional one. And the fact that it is a mixed one with majority voting in reality leads to the fact that the Bundestag, the parliament, is bigger than it's supposed to be, 730 deputies in this election.
And as Antaios mentioned, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. For example, in 2009, the result would actually not have resulted in a majority for Merkel under the new rules, but the Supreme Court ruling a few years ago, of course, changed the system, which accelerated the ballooning of the Bundestag. And I mean, this is a very mild case of what we got today. There have been projections in the past few weeks that could have led to a parliament of well over 900 MPs. So, woohoo, small parliaments.
And I know how we were talking a few days ago that similar to the we were having a conversation in regards to how in the United States we have our precinct conventions, which lead to county elections, which leads to state conventions, and eventually the national one. But of course, as it is very different from what we have here in the United States, especially with your difference between electing somebody directly, as we do with, say, our congressional representatives, and then comparison to your party selection for leadership, which is far more parliamentarian and not as democratic as, say, the United States is. And so with that being said, I think that's a good way to sort of introduce the big who's who of the major parties of, you know, the German election. I think the biggest there are, I think, six that we should be focusing on today. You have your traditional CDU, Christian Democratic Union, or also aligned with the Bavarian CSU. They've been Merkel's party, and they've been in power technically the longest, with Merkel in charge as chancellor under various coalition governments. She has been in power for 16 years. And the ironic thing is that she will also be in power when the most likely negotiations for coalition government happens, shortly after all the results are tallied up. The next one will be the Social Democratic Party, also known as the SPD, sort of a centrist, center-left kind of party. And then more recently, we've had the Alternative für Deutschland Party, the sort of what is labeled as far-right anti-immigration party. And it is a more recent phenomenon. And they've done well in the last election in 2017, although they haven't done nearly as well as they have in this election. The FDP, which is the Free Democratic Party, which is a sort of neoliberal center-right, primarily focused on markets. You have the left, Der Linke, which is a split off from the SPD, as it was explained to me off stream, sort of a result of the SPD sort of embracing a more market-oriented approach in their politics. And then we have the Greens, which are primarily focused on things such as human rights and climate change and trying to pursue more carbon-free based policies. Those are going to be the six that we talk about, but I think that the two big names out of those six are going to be that of the CDU and the SPD, as they've taken in the largest amount of the vote so far. So with that being said, gentlemen, let's start with the CDU and the leader there.
Is this already let's talk about Angela Merkel and how her face changed over the duration of her
Well, yeah, absolutely, because with the CDU's leadership, although he's Mr. Lanchette, I believe is the way to pronounce his name. Pardon me if I butcher it. You know, they've been very tepid about being around Merkel. There have been many articles that have labeled her as a individual who is toxic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the interesting thing with Merkel is she came as a kind of Hail Mary for the CDU. So in the beginning, it was believed, and for a very long time, it was believed that she was and she was even called a Machiavellian, that she had kind of organized and politicized her way through the German political landscape and that way, in the end, finally made it to the top, to the highest office in Germany, the chancellorate. But, and this is something I only know because my father extensively researched her political career for his documentary, which was never made, for the very simple reason is that it isn't true and that there's nothing really interesting about her. The reality is that the CDU was faced with a rapidly changing culture. And we're, of course, talking 16 years back. So this is still before the Obama revolution, but all of that was already in its revolution in air quotes, but all of that kind of going away from the, let's say, the neocon angle to the world and the phony Christianity of that time that dominated the culture back then. All of that had already faded out, and now they needed a new face for the party. And they preferably needed someone who kind of wasn't what people had started to associate with the CDU, which were old men, usually Catholic, usually from West Germany. And so they got of course, a female physicist from Eastern Germany, and kind of made her into the party, into the new face of the party, of in air quotes, new CDU. And they've almost simulated a candidate taking over the party to kind of sell to the public that the CDU was now more modern, more with the times and everything. And so in the beginning, she was treated mostly as this kind of Machiavellian genius politician who had shown it to the men. I mean, this is a time where women power was really high, where everybody still thought that feminists were cool, that kind of era. So she was sold as that as first. And then she kind of took over, it kind of mediated, it kind of changed into the, let's say, the center of the Merkel reign, which is something we've already talked about before the stream, the kind of Mutti Merkel time. Mutti is a German word that more or less word for word translates into mummy, so Mummy Merkel. And you can already see the complete death of the German spirit in there. But besides that, this was really the time where she was seen as kind of the patroness of Germany, one of the best politicians in the world. This was a time where being a woman made her completely impervious to criticism, because every criticism of her was just veiled sexism. And instead, she took on the persona of this vague personality that was always there for Germany. This is the Merkel that kind of got Germany through the 2008 financial crisis, which was her biggest political victory, in air quotes. And that was the personality that she garnered until very recently. And the more recent one is the, let's say, Danke Merkel or toxic Merkel personality that started with a lot of young people kind of being disillusioned with politics. There have been, back in the day, already kind of like breaking points of especially young German YouTubers or German YouTubers that are targeted at young demographics, kind of speaking out a lot against establishment politicians, of course, being kind of indoctrinated politcommissars for the Green Party, and why the CDU and everything is evil. And this kind of got Merkel the eye or the perception of a stooge in large parts of the German population. At the same time, you, of course, had the start of mass migration and the Pegida movement, which started the AfD. And that is what gave rise to the breaking away on the right side of the CDU, who saw Merkel as nothing more than a functionary of establishment party politics, which were essentially left-wing. And so you have now two sides, both to the left and to the right of the CDU, which see her as old, as decrepit, as unable to do politics, and a CDU in the middle that calls itself now the Center Party instead of what it used to be, the most right-wing party in Germany, and a Merkel that kind of tries to sell this, or tried to sell this version of a very centered person, of a person that is very rational, very reasonable, but kind of failed to sell it to either of these sides. And now she's mostly seen as a phony by, I would say, mostly the younger demographic, but also older demographics, especially with the start of the virus.
Yeah, I would agree with your analysis here. It is quite striking how Merkel maneuvers from one position to the other. So I remember a speech by her, it was some 20 odd years ago, where she said, Multikulti ist gescheitert, so multiculturalism has failed. And that Germany is a Christian country, Islam is no part of Germany, and Germany is no immigration country. But then fast forward 2015, when the migrant crisis hit, and in the public there was really a feeling of welcoming. It was really a lot of people agreed that we should do a lot to help those migrants coming over from war-torn Syria. And here Merkel did a 360 and she said, okay, wir schaffen das, we can do it, yes, we can. And she decided to keep the borders open. And another criticism, which you could label as Machiavellian, is how she dealt with inner competitors in the parties. So Christian Wulff is an example, a former president, a former federal president, though the German president is not as powerful as the American one. He said some problematic things in public, or Horst Köhler, he said some things about the intervention in Afghanistan, both former federal presidents, and Merkel had no problems in having them kicked out. And some have said that Merkel saw them as internal rivals and that Merkel facilitated it. I wouldn't go that far. I would say she supported it, but I would agree with you, ST, that Merkel is rather a pawn. And there's a rather interesting anecdote of Helmut Kohl, who also was chancellor for 16 years. So he was chancellor before Gerhard Schröder, and after Gerhard Schröder, Merkel became chancellor. And Helmut Kohl, just like Merkel, he ruled for 16 years. And he said, we had to train Merkel on how to eat with fork and knife. So there you have it. Merkel really needed some training, and Kohl took care of her, and then the grey eminences in the CDU, I would say they groomed her and brought her to the position where she is now.
The thing about the CDU in the 90s is that in 1998, Helmut Kohl tried to run for a 5th term, but got soundly beaten in the election. And there was no heir apparent because the crown prince, as it was, had become a cripple due to an assassination attempt on his life, Wolfgang Schäuble. He became party leader in 1998 and opposition leader. But not only was it clear that he was never a viable option for chancellor, he also was struck down by a corruption scandal within 2 years, I think. And one of the arguments for Merkel was that most people assumed she wouldn't last long anyway because they didn't think very highly of her. And of course, her being from Eastern Germany made it reasonably certain that she was not a part of some ancient power and corruption network within the party. So they let her run with it. And essentially, in Germany, parties are highly hierarchical. There's strong top-down power exerted from the leader, usually to the down to the party level. And if you're the party leader, you are the party leader. You make the calls, you make the decisions, and basically, it's the whole thing is a top-down structure. And from this position onward, Merkel basically spent all her energy in remaining leader of the CDU and remaining chancellor. Up until the refugee crisis, she was dearly beloved by many on the right and heavily criticized by many on the left. And one left-wing comedian, Volker Pispers, once said about her, she isn't really interested in politics, she just enjoys being chancellor. And to some degree, I think that still really nails it. There are little positions she really held on to, and it's almost a miracle that she's kept the illusion of being, or not the illusion, or kept the position of being pro-immigration for 6 years now. Spineless isn't really an adequate term. She's doing 180s on everything.
Yes, and you need to take into account that the CDU means Christlich-Demokratische Union. So it's a Christian party. It is supposed to be a conservative party. And the decision she took to take so many Muslim immigrants in, it really spawned the AfD. I mean, the AfD was already around at that time, but it really gave the AfD the opportunity to move into that right-wing direction and to criticize the CDU for not being conservative anymore. And there's another 180 that Merkel did. This was on climate change. So the CDU is, yes, conservative. You have also the FDP, which is the liberal party, but it's not liberal in the US sense. It's more libertarian, or in the UK, Lib Dems. So they are very much in favor of low taxes. But the CDU is kind of in the middle. The CDU is more to the middle right, also in favor of big companies and the entrepreneurial spirit. And I mean, Merkel decided to phase out coal, to phase out nuclear energy. I believe it was still under her that the EEG Umlage was decided upon. This is a law that says if you are producing renewable energies and you feed this into the electricity grids, then you have a guaranteed price. So you have a minimum price at which this electricity will be bought. And this is, of course, an incentive that leads to the fact that you have more renewable energies like windmills and the like. But it is not really efficient, and the prices for electricity are sky high. We in Germany, we pay the highest electricity prices. We pay, I think, with France, the highest prices for gas. And this was done under a conservative, Christian, liberal party, from which you would expect more respect for the individual, more respect for the company to take their own decisions. But Merkel clearly created this policy where you have incentives to go into a climate neutral policy, and where it's really not in the decision of the companies, because we had quite a bit of nuclear power plants, and they're going to be phased out in, I think, the next year, all of them. And coal, all the coal plants are about to be phased out in 2038. This was done under Merkel. But this is, of course, not enough for the Green Party. The Green Party would like to see the coal plants phased out much earlier. But again, there's really a consensus, and not even the FDP, which is the libertarian-ish party, is really against this. The FDP has also accepted that coal will be phased out by 2038.
I think something to kind of illustrate this, or why this is happening, is to mention that Merkel has in her entire career never made a judgment call. So I think Prude's most viewers are all American. I think the vast majority of them are also from our spheres and know about the idea of the cathedral. And this is something that is, although not talked about a lot in Germany, is actually way more applying to us than anybody else, maybe because it is just so obvious and so direct. All of Merkel's policies, all of them, are just more or less laid before her by an advisor class that is recruited exclusively from the German university system. They then prepare studies on different topics. So, for example, our policy in terms of demographics. Our demographic policy is completely ripped out of the works of different sociologists. In fact, I'm working on those works for my bachelor's thesis right now. I could give you the names of the people that have more or less written German demographic policy in the 1970s. And she is just a rubber stamp for those initiatives. And that is how she, as a quote unquote, Christian and conservative politician, did all those things Antaios just described, because that is, of course, the position of the academia, and she has never delineated from that, nor is she in the habit of making judgment calls, and that more or less explains that part.
Now, and someone in chat just asked if she's just an opportunist. To some degree, yes. I mean, there's probably not a single German chancellor in history so far who has been so consistently looking at the opinion polls and then just gradually or by tendance went in the direction that the polls swung. Important to know is that in Germany, the idea of being on the right is rejected even as an abstract. So the CDU would never call itself a right-wing party, and they are even very hesitant to call themselves a conservative party. If you asked Merkel about the political stance of the CDU, she would say, well, yes, the CDU has like 3 roots. We are partially conservative, partially liberal, and the third root is Christian social teachings. And of her 4 terms, 3 she served in coalition with the SPD, and basically during most of that time, she essentially just sold out to the SPD and just rubber-stamped everything they proposed. And whenever faced with something like that, she would say, oh, well, we have to adhere to Christian social teachings, or that's perfectly in line with the liberal traditions of our party. So she would always, so to speak, take 2 of the 3 routes to argue against why the position that her party had campaigned on and been elected for was actually wrong, and why she had to do a 180 on all of that.
So
Yeah, I think that. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. I think that is actually something very important for international viewers to kind of really point out how detested being right-wing is in Germany. Germany has a very efficient system of education, in that its education system turns out people that are indoctrinated with certain beliefs. And of course, one of the best techniques to that is kind of scaring people into being left-wing. The way you do that is you scare them by the atrocities of the Third Reich. This is shown to children at an extremely young age, immediately kind of connected to right-wing positions and right-wing policies. And from there on, you have a kind of, they're made into politcommissars for various left-wing causes, which is why in Germany you see basically everybody in our generation. I think I'm the youngest one here on the panel, and I'm more or less the youngest conservative in Germany, not quite, but more or less just falter and fall on the left side. Being radically left-wing is seen as a very normal thing in Germany. Being moderately right-wing is seen as problematic. Calling somebody a right-winger is an insult. Increasingly, even calling somebody a German is an insult. I remember when I was in school, I would play up my Danish heritage to, which is like something ridiculous. Like one of my great-grandparents lived in a part of Denmark, but was still German. But something like that. I played it up simply to not count as German, because that was also just a kind of social marker of unacceptance. You couldn't be German back in school, and that really brands our thinking as a people, and to some degree also our politics. Yeah.
I would like to pick up on the point that you were making, ST, that the German culture is very much against the right and against the right and pro-left, and that this is a top-down phenomenon. First, I will say this: when I was in France during an Erasmus exchange, I saw political posters, and they would say "Votez pour le droit," vote for the right, and this was not ironic. And it was a major party. And at this moment, I realized the same thing you were talking about. So in France, you can say, vote for the right, vote for us. But this would never happen in Germany, because it is political suicide to do so. And it gets clear why it is when we look at the structure of how the narrative is created and maintained in Germany. So first, there is something which is called the ARD and the ZDF. There are the
public broadcasting companies, something which our English viewers, our UK viewers are familiar with, something that I believe does not exist in the United States. So in Germany, everybody has to pay, I think it's 17 euros or so. Every household has to pay 17 euros per month in order to fund the public broadcasting system. And it is the parties, along with other organizations from society. I think some churches are also influential here, but it's mostly the parties. And the parties decide who will head these broadcasting companies. So this is the first one. Now, the second one is that there is also something which does not exist in the US. The US has the First Amendment, and there is freedom of speech, absolute freedom of speech. In Germany,
You might want to put an asterisk on that freedom of speech here in the US.
Well, according to the Constitution, there is. There is no way the state can tell you what to say and what not to say, as long as you're not inciting violence. Because in the US, it is the social media who are enforcing censorship. But in Germany, it is not only the social media, the woke social media like Facebook and YouTube, but on top, you have the so-called Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, the network enforcement law. And this law stipulates that social media have to censor the content on their platforms in order to be in compliance with German law. For instance, everything that is critical of the Holocaust is you can get into prison for that in Germany. And there are also many other things which are illegal. And it happened, I'm not joking, that Gab received a letter by the German Department of Justice. A letter sent to Gab in California. Hey, we saw this post on your platform. Please remove it according to the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, according to the German enforcement law. Yes, this is the state in Germany which is very, very different from the US, not so different from the UK, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, for anyone who's been spicy on Twitter and has had their tweets reported, you've probably received a notification about German law being allegedly violated. I've had that happen once or twice, so yeah, I'm familiar with the network enforcement law. But I think we've pretty accurately sort of described now, more or less, the reasons, as well as some of the legal backgrounds that has made Merkel unpopular, between conceding a lot of policy positions to the SPD, taking the lead on climate issues, that way not losing out to the Greens. There doesn't seem to be a lot of first principles or positions that she's held. And to point out here, Norwich, yes, the election is today, and the polls have been closed now for a little over 2 hours. So we're getting results that I have on screen here discussing that. But now that we've sort of discussed Merkel and her unpopularity and her labeling as toxic, I think that that's a good transition to sort of talk about the two leading parties so far in today's election, which would be the CDU and the SPD, and their leadership as well. So with that being said, I think it would be a good place to start with the leading candidate or leading potential future chancellor, which would be that of the SPD, Olaf Scholz, and sort of break down their positions and what might happen under their leadership if they, claim their mandate, so to speak.
Olaf Scholz has had a very long career in his party, where he was usually very unfavorably seen. He was already one of the leading figures of the youth movement of the Social Democrats in the early 80s, and was, regarding his future stance on foreign policy, strictly opposed to stationing Pershing II rockets in Germany, where he was in perfect alignment with, of course, Eastern Germany and their policy in trying to force the hand of the German government. essentially, there's two wings in the SPD, the Seeheimer Kreis, the more conservative, quote unquote, conservative for the standards of an old left party, and the more left wing wing of the party. And Olaf Scholz is, so to speak, like the last beacon of the more conservative wing of old Labour. In this regard, maybe a bit comparable to Keir Starmer in the UK. He was vastly unpopular when he was like vice chairman of the party. He routinely scored very poor results in party conferences. And when last year, or maybe 2 years ago, party leadership was contested, the youth movement of the party, the Jusos, Young Socialists, fought tooth and nail against him becoming the leader of the party, which made it somewhat surprising that he was then chosen to be the candidate for the party, and that the party, for their standards, shut their mouth during campaigning. So, should Olaf Scholz ever head a government in Germany, it would be in a highly unstable government. His own party does overwhelmingly not share his vision on policy. The Green Party is, on a great many issues, pretty spineless, so they would probably play along. But the left-wing party, they, on the other hand, they are zealots. So, I mean, the chances of Olaf Scholz heading a stable government in Germany are extremely slim.
Gentlemen, other thoughts? ST, Anteos?
I mean, this is more my weak suit, but I do have a friend who is part of the SPD. I think he's also part of the Seehofer or Seeheimer or whatever faction, so the more quote-unquote conservative part. Actually, he said there's three parts. So there's like the more conservative part, the more left-wing part, so the more conservative part leading towards the CDU, the more left-wing part leading towards the Linke. And then there's a third group, which I call the Netzwerker, which is called networking, and which he just said they're basically opportunists. So essentially real politicians and not people who are just ideologues in government. I think the thing with the SPD is that, or the reason they gain so much is that they have a more authentic form of something that resembles conservatism. I would say that every person in history ever is more or less conservative. It's kind of close, right? There's conservatism that is more in line with, let's say, the Roman Empire, third edition of history. That is, they've been allowed, or they're very, very
ST, you're coming off like a robot.
Big ones. Okay, then I can't do something about that. I'll join back in a minute, okay?
Okay, no worries. With that being said, Anteus, do you want to come in and have some thoughts on the SPD?
What I will mention here is two scandals. I mean, we all like scandals, and Olaf Scholz has been involved in two. Those came up very often in the elections. Now, the first one is the scandal about the Warburg Bank. This bank committed dividend stripping on a very high scale. I think it's 10 or 20 billion euros, which they got back from the government without having actually the right to get it. And this was during Olaf Scholz's mayorship of Hamburg. Hamburg is a known state, like in the US. So this was under his watch. And then there's also the Wirecard scandal, Wirecard being a German payment provider. And what Wirecard did, they created accounts that did not exist. So they created accounts in the ballpark of 1-2 billion, which just was not there. The CEO, I think he's still on the run. And both Merkel and Scholz, and like everybody, was saying Wirecard is phenomenal. It's tremendous. It's great that German companies are venturing into digital payments. And mind that, Olaf Scholz is the incumbent Secretary of Finance. So this also happened under his watch, and it kind of tainted his reputation, though the other candidates of the CDU and especially of the Green Party, they have much more problems. And it is quite amazing that although Scholz was involved in these two scandals, he was kind of seen as the good one. Because his competitors, they just made so many mistakes that he had easy game.
I mean, Olaf Scholz is, of course, not a conservative figure, but he is, of course, resembling continuity. I mean, the mainstream in Germany, just as in many other Western countries, but maybe more so, is different brands of social democracy. So he, as a candidate, is an obvious continuation of the policy of the last few years. And since large parts of the electorate are way beyond 60, he had an easy time of branding himself to be like this reliable, staunch figure. We've heard talk about a robotic voice a moment ago, and one of the nicknames of Olaf Scholz is Scholzomat, because he has a hard time of speaking. And this is not like us here in the panel of a second language, but even in his mother tongue, to stack together 2 or 3 sentences after another. And as Antaios alluded to, the other candidates were almost ridiculous decisions to have them as candidates. I mean, in another occasion, I compared Armin Laschet, the candidate for the CDU, to which we'll get, as a combination of maybe Chris Christie and Jeb Bush. I mean, it was a ridiculous decision to run with him. So Olaf Scholz is the beneficiary of the blunders of other parties. And that being said, I would argue that his victory is essentially a Pyrrhic victory, and I would bet good money that he will not be in any shape or form part of a future German government.
Is the robot voice still there?
No, you sound good now.
Okay, perfect. So just to kind of finish my train of thought here. So the SPD has a very long history. It's the only party that existed before the Second World War. And they're actually, let's say, people that are played up as great German heroes in German history, media, and the schools that have been SPD politicians. So they can kind of rely on that and tell a story that is that feels like something old without being so German or right-wing, in which way the people are afraid of, or which they are trained to oppose, which they are conditioned against. So they can kind of link themselves ideologically to the French Revolution, to the Enlightenment, those kind of values, socialism, which is seen as a very high good in Germany. And they, of course, have always been a more market-oriented party. So they have never really had let's say, a communist veneer. They have actually been responsible for one of Germany's, or the German Wirtschaftswunder. So in that kind of train of thought, they can do something in Germany, or can provide something that gives people the need for continuity, the need for something conservative that is ingrained in everybody, without actually being conservative, without having any continuity to a European past, to Christendom, to anything like that. They instead have a continuity towards the revolution, towards the Freiburschen and the Burschenschaften, and all those kind of things that have plopped up in Germany ever since the Renaissance.
Well, I think that gives us a good way to transition now towards the discussion of coalitions. And I mean, there's been a lot of, the polling, as I have on screen here, has shown quite a few ups and downs, from a quick downfall of the CDU, which I think is a really good way to show just the problems. We talked about Olaf Scholz being, the issue candidate within his party, but it's not like Mr. Armin Laschet has been particularly popular either. I know that we had discussed leading up to this stream that he has been a regular feature on talk show hosts and sort of Sunday shows, as well as sort of being a stand-in for Merkel and being a Merkel lackey. So, and not that he also has a very particularly strong popular presence either. I've been told by not just you guys, but by others that he has the personality of a 2x4, a very bland and sort of blank-faced candidate when discussing what is to come next for Germany. And I think we can kind of see that with the polling that I have on screen here, just this declining popularity, a potential rise, and then down once again. Many have been saying, both in the mainstream and other commentators I've been following, have been saying that this is sort of a left-leaning or a left-way revolt about, after 16 years of this Merkel coalition. And so with that being said, I just think that it's interesting that we're at this position where we're once again going to be negotiating in Germany what kind of government we're going to see and what really changes. Because, as someone had mentioned in chat, that there's whoever really wins out of all the winners here, so to speak, it's the Greens that win because they'll be the deciding factor for a future coalition government.
So this Bundestag is very special in many respects. I think it is, if the left party makes it into the Bundestag, if the left party can jump over the 5% hurdle, the 5% threshold, then they will enter the Bundestag. If they get less than 5%, they won't enter the Bundestag. So if they make it into the Bundestag, we're going to have 6 parties. And this was never the case. Up until, I think, 20, 30 years before, there were just 3 parties, CDU, CSU, SPD, and FDP. And they just shared the power. And then in the 80s, there came the Green Party. In the 90s, there came the Linkspartei, the Left Party. And then very recently, the AfD. So a lot of people are talking about Weimar conditions, because also the Weimar Republic was very fragmented. And this really makes it difficult to form a functioning coalition. So I'm going to talk about the coalition I think is most likely. And this is, I think, Prude, we agree here, this is a grand coalition. This is a continuation of what we have now. At the moment, we have a coalition between the conservative CDU, CSU and the Social Democrat SPD. Angela Merkel as Chancellor and Olaf Scholz, who is the current candidate for the SPD, as Secretary of Finance. I believe that this is the most likely coalition. I give it a 70% chance. I know that Mono and ST might have a different point of view, but I will point out this. What other options are there? A coalition together with the left party, for instance, Social Democrat SPD, Green Party, and the leftists is not possible because the leftists are too weak. This is off the table. Nobody wants to play with the right-wing AfD. So there's no way anybody is going to make a coalition with them. So we are really left with the FDP and the Greens. They are the wild cards. And it's going to be either the CDU, who partners with the Greens and the FDP, or it's going to be the SPD, who's going to partner with them. But here I will point out why I believe this is very unlikely. We had these very same, we had coalition talks about a so-called traffic light, about a Jamaica coalition, about a coalition between the CDU, the Green Party, and the FDP in 2017. And the differences between the Green Party and the FDP were too strong because to the Greens, social justice is really important and climate change, but climate change engineered by the state. The Green Party wants a wealth tax. They want to tax everybody who owns more than 2 million euros, 1% annually. They want to subsidize electronic vehicles. They want to heavily subsidize any measures towards climate neutrality. And the FDP, they are the more or less libertarian party, neoliberal party. And I cannot imagine that they will accept it. But in the case that such a coalition comes to be, I will say now that this will be a highly inefficient coalition. This coalition will do tremendous damage to anyone who is involved in it, and whoever is in the opposition will do just fine, and in the next elections will rise to power.
Something that might be of interest regarding a Jamaica coalition is that, and here's where Laschet and Merkel differentiate, Merkel rarely had strong secretaries and ministers. Usually her government was very blunt figures, and basically she had a terrible working relationship with anyone who had a strong personality. Laschet is a bit different. If we look at how he goes about his office of Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, he is willing to let the ministers shine, to let them take the spotlight. In 2017, as you mentioned, the talks about the Jamaica coalition failed. The problem, however, there was that on every issue, Angela Merkel took the position of the Green Party. So the longer the talks progressed, the FDP realized we don't get anything out of this deal. And one of their almost traumas was that in the general election of 2013, they fell below the 5% threshold because yet again we talked about how Merkel was toxic and was leading towards the Social Democrats, because they essentially could not get through on any issue. So the FDP was very keen on securing a strong deal in the negotiations, which they weren't able to in 2017. Now, the Green Party has had a complete change of personnel regarding their leaders since 2017. And they really turned the corner on everything related to, let's call it, woke capital. So all of that stuff, wealth tax and so on, I'm convinced the Green Party is perfectly willing to fold on all of that. The Green Party has two leaders, the one with which they ran as a candidate, Annalena Baerbock, who is, of course, weakened now due to the weak showing. And as the other leader, Robert Habeck, who would have obviously been the much better choice as a candidate for the Green Party, and who already negotiated the Jamaica coalition in his country of origin, in northern Germany, Schleswig-Holstein. And he has a good working relationship with the leader of the FDP. As both have already stated on TV this evening, is that FDP and the Green Party will start negotiations for a coalition. So this will be the nucleus of a new coalition, regardless of the SPD or the CDU being the third man in the deal. Now, who is more likely to fold on most of the issues? The CDU under Laschet or the SPD with a weak leader and a middle management of the party who is increasingly zealous? That's why I believe that the Jamaica coalition is by far the most likely outcome of upcoming coalition talks.
There was a question in the chat that asked, why do you guys take the view of the Jamaica coalition rather than just, say, a red-black coalition between the CDU and the SDP?
I understand you, Mono, that you say a Jamaica coalition is possible because Laschet is willing to let the others shine. He's willing to step back and to let the Green Party and the FDP make a deal. Is this your argument?
Well, basically, yes. I mean, the FDP already weeks ago mentioned what would be their asking price for any future coalition. And one of them was no new taxes and a bit of moderation regarding new debt. And this is something to which I would think the CDU would get around to and the Green Party could agree on. Regarding the question from chat on the Grand Coalition, SPD and CDU are fairly close by now. The SPD is convinced that a Grand Coalition is dragging them down and is about to kill the party in the long haul. So I think the SPD would never be down for a Grand Coalition. Potentially some would go for it if they could lead the coalition, but why would the CDU do this? I mean, the CDU always has the incentive if there were to be new elections, they could just select a new candidate and score a vastly better result. So I really don't see why the CDU would back down on any issue in negotiations for a grand coalition where they are not the leaders. So neither of the two big parties would play the role of the minor partner in a grand coalition. So I don't see how this would be a possible option.
Okay, so you were saying that you see a possibility that the FDP and the Green Party go together. But I will say this. The most important issue to the Green Party, and this is right at the beginning of their political manifesto, is climate change, is climate neutrality. They want to achieve it by, I think, 2045. Germany has to be climate neutral. They want to do the phase out of coal even before 2038, even before Merkel's plan. They want to subsidize heavily renewable energies. Now, in order to do this, you will need a lot of taxes. They don't want to get rid of minimum prices for electricity created by renewable energies. Now, these are all points that the FDP is very hostile on. The position of the FDP is, yes, climate change is real, climate change is important, but this is something which the free market will take care of. And I ask you, how are those differences, how can those differences be resolved between the Green Party and the FDP?
Now, I would say that within the Green Party, you can identify at least three tribes. One is, let's call them the urbanite weirdos. I mean, most of us have probably seen that ghastly image from Berlin that has been making the rounds in recent weeks. Essentially, bio-Leninism in one picture. Then there's like hippies, new left, old boomers. And then the third tribe, there's, let's call them like the wine moms, like the urban housewives that do yoga and so on. And these people would probably be absolutely down for a Jamaica coalition. Because it gives them a nice warm feeling knowing that they've done something about climate change. So I think that large parts of middle management, of the party bureaucracy, of the Green Party is indeed hostile to the FDP, and they really resent the party. I think in the grand scheme of things, both Robert Habeck, who's in a very strong position right now, and large parts of the voters of the Green Party as well, would absolutely fault on any issue in negotiations with the FDP, as long as they get maybe like 2 or 3 token projects that they can cultivate.
All right, I must say I don't have such a Machiavellian perception of the Green Party. I do think that most of the voters of the base of the Green Party and also most of the bureaucrats inside the party are really convinced that what they are doing is right. I believe truly that they are ideologues. And there is one problem. So, for instance, in the political manifesto, the Green Party says we need a climate protection council. So what they want to create is a ministry which will screen any law to be passed if it is compatible with the goals with reaching climate neutrality. So they want nothing less than a ministry that can shoot down any law. And there is no way that the FDP is going to accept this. And Lindner, so the leader of the FDP, has already said that he will want to become Secretary of Finance. Because if he is Secretary of Finance, he really pulls the strings. He can control the budget. And it is not only climate change, but since this discussion is focused on foreign policy, it is also the concept about how the European Union should be like. So the FDP, they want a European Union which has a strong military and that does more in terms of foreign policy. But they do not want a fiscal or a social European Union. The FDP does not want that Germany pays the debts of the French, the Italians, or the Greeks. However, the Green Party and also the SPD, they envision a more social European Union. They envision a fiscal union. So again, I ask you, how will you square these differences?
Now, I mean, I hope we don't drown out the other panelists with this discussion between almost the two of us. But yes, everything you said is true. However, the Green Party is, to throw something completely different into the mix, is also a competitor of the SPD. So if they are like the only left-leaning party in government and they get the spotlight, that's of course something which would strengthen them. Because if the alternative is a coalition with the Green Party and the SPD and someone else, this would of course strengthen the SPD, which over the last few election cycles has been in a downward trend. So of course it's not an ideal matchup between the FDP and the Green Party. However, I think among the ones that are on the table, I think this is the more likely. But I mean, yeah, we'll see in the upcoming weeks how willing the parties are to give up ground on various issues. I mean, it has already been flung around TV this evening that we might not get a new government until Christmas. So we are probably up for some very lengthy talks for the new coalition.
We have to deal with Merkel for a little more, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there's been talks that she may have to give the Christmas address in case no new government is formed, and Lachette has been very adamant that that shouldn't happen. But we've been talking about climate change, and I think that'll be a good way to transition to foreign policy in just a moment. I did want to bring up these two graphics. The first one on screen about the German voters over the age of 60, predominantly taking the parties of the CDU and its CSU sister party, as well as with SPD. And I thought that was, it doesn't surprise me at all with how this poll looks. I mean, this looks traditional towards the American system where majority of voters are older, or at least the more participatory. Here in the United States, if you were to go to conventions or to primary votes, it is typically the older, more of the base of the party, especially based on my examples working in the electoral system in the United States. We're in Texas, where I live, is mainly older voters over 60. So this graphic here doesn't surprise me. And I know that we talked prior to stream that it doesn't either for you all. But then Mono had sent me a lovely graphic talking about first-time voters. And let me bring that one up so we can all see, because I think this is where the media narrative, that consensus-making apparatus about this being a election for change is going to be coming up quite often, about first-time voters, which are typically younger or not as politically involved. And the two largest there were the Greens and the FDP, making up a substantial percentage of the first-time voters in this Bundestag election. And I was just wondering if the panel had any thoughts here.
Oh no, you're good.
Well, it seems that the upcoming generation is very liberal and very much into climate protection. And I was not aware that this is actually the trend. So these are first-time voters. How do you know that these are young people, or might it just be people who weren't interested in politics before?
I mean, in my traditional understanding of politics, I didn't. Mono would have to answer that based on the data here from the polling. But for me, it's usually on the grounds that first-time voters are usually people that haven't had a chance to vote before, either because they were under the age of majority. I believe you guys are automatically registered to vote once you all turn 18 in Germany, whereas in the United States you have to register. But based on my experience working at it, first-time voters typically means the young or the politically disinterested, which is usually people who are ranging anywhere from their 20s to their 40s. Those who typically don't vote or go back, it doesn't mean anything, which that can be a conversation for a whole other time. But in my experience, it's usually the young.
Okay, so what you're saying makes sense here. So I think what we can learn from this is that maybe the new mainstream is going to be liberalism and climate protection, and that the SPD and the CDU, the parties of the middle, are becoming less interesting. So maybe the new Volksparteien The new so-called mainstream parties are the FDP and the Green Party. What is striking is that the extreme parties to the left and to the right garner the least votes, the Linke and the AfD. And one thing that I will point out about the FDP and the Green Party is this. The more money you make, the higher up the social echelons are, the more likely you are to vote FDP and Green Party. And I would like to get back to the point that the Green Party is truly ideological, that the people who vote for them truly believe in it, because it might have changed, but a poll that I read some years ago indicated that the voters of the Green Party make more money than voters of the FDP. And it is usually like businessmen, like really rich people who vote for FDP. If it's really reflective of the young people, and this is why I asked, I was just wondering, how on earth can the FDP, the Liberal Party, be so attractive to young people? I mean, they are not in the age that they make a lot of money, so it must be something different. But maybe Mono and ST, you can talk to this.
Yeah, so I mentioned I have a friend who's part of the SPD, and actually something I immediately had to think about when I saw this just now is there was in, I think, 2019, I went out with him in Wiesbaden, which is a medium-sized city in Germany. And he went campaigning for the SPD, and he had invited me because I was over, and campaigning for a party in a party youth group usually means drinking a lot. And so basically we took that as a party opportunity, no pun intended. Part of that, however, was going around talking to random strangers and asking them how they felt about politics. And of course, me being a closeted monarchist, just standing there and observing the situation, I found out something very interesting, and that is that, or something you have to know before that about Germany that isn't too hard to figure out, is that Germany is more or less a cultural satellite of the globalist American empire. All our positions are basically reused American positions. Sometimes we are even in a position to influence American positions. For example, the Green Movement started more with us than it did with the Americans, although the Green Movement in its current form is mostly an import. Something I realized is that a lot of the people the people we asked, they were all young people, all our age groups, so in their early 20s. And the only answers we got were the Greens, the FDP, or I don't want to talk about it, or I'm not going to vote. The people who voted the FDP are basically the entire barstool conservative branch. A lot of Trump's influence and Trump's popularity has factored into that, as well as characters like John Stossel and the rise of the libertarians in America. You can see, of course, in America, the libertarians have done in, I think, 2016 as well if they've never done before. I don't know how well they did in 2020. But they have gained some real weight behind them. I mean, we can even say that, for example, the cultural phenomenon we now see with AA in England and so on and so forth is even a branching away from that part, which just kind of gives it, as a broader cultural field, a bigger strength or a bigger weight to it as influential in younger demographics. So the Greens here are essentially an import of America, which you would see around the people like my favorite politician, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is unironic. She is my favorite politician because I think she's as politician as politicians can get. I think she's distilled political juice in one person. And that entire movement that you see there, of course, with what we call liberalism, used to be called social justice and everything like that. And the FDP is the kind of counter movement against that, the barstool conservatives, who have already folded all the the conservative positions always do in the West, have already folded almost all conservative positions, and are just kind of there to present a new rightwards barrier that will now exclude the CDU, So Christianity will then be part of a fringe position as Cthulhu further swims left into the green field.
Now, these have been a lot of great points with which I can only agree. Yes, the Green Party is a highly bourgeois party. Not only are they the party that cares the most about emissions, they are also the party whose voters fly the most, have the highest proportion of owners of SUVs, and so on. I mean, one of the issues with first-time voters, and I really do think this is about like 18, 19-year-olds. I've never heard the term used in any other regard. The CDU is risibly weak in online, so they really have no digital infrastructure. So, even less so than the FDP, the Greens, and other parties. I mean, the AfD is damaged goods. I mean, as a brand, I don't think this is salvageable for any electorate. Die Linke is obviously filled to the brim with weird, fucked up people. I mean, basically bio-Leninism cranked up to 11. So I kind of get why the FDP is so strong among Zoomers. And beyond that, the FDP and the Green Party agree on one more issue, which hasn't been mentioned so far, the legalization of pot, which I think is really a good candidate for a popular token issue for the new coalition. Beyond that, I mean, I just posted 2 images in the Twitter group chat. Maybe we can take a look at the leader of the FDP here, Christian Lindner. I think he is, and that's not saying much, of the party leaders, the one that appeals the most to young people and to the, let's say, the aspirational class, as you might call them abroad. Like the young urban professionals, the people who went to college even though they shouldn't have. So, I mean, I kind of get why there's some appeal for young people to vote FDP. Yes, it is. You have the virgin Armin Laschet giving fire to the chat, Christian Lindner, who is, by the way, also a reservist for the German armed forces, and who pretty much looks like Hank Scorpio from The Simpsons.
We got a comment from Belvik. He questioned whether people really believe in the BS, quote unquote, that the Green Party is peddling, that the Green Party is talking about. In order to address this point, I would also like to share my screen, if I may.
Oh, sure. Let me just hold on. Stop screen sharing.
Right.
You should have the ability to.
Yes, I do have it now. Yes, so can you see my screen? Great. So this is a Twitter of Hungerstreik, hunger strike. And this is a trend that has started. And so what they are doing is actually they're camping outside. They're saying, oh, such and such has gone on hunger strike, and now he's going to go on dry hunger strike. And then they're like, oh, no, I had to go to the hospital. And they film each other and everything. And if you want to have fun, just look at it. And the comments, they are great, like people posting like delicious meals. And this is for real. There's no way that the people who are doing this actually believe that they are the last generation, as they say. I'm just going to post a link to this Twitter in the chat. Let me.
Oops.
Uh-oh.
He heated himself.
I think he turned off his position there rather than. Oh, there he is. I'll add him back. Yeah, you've returned.
Alrighty, I have returned. Let me just post the link real quick.
Put it in the private chat because I'd have to make you a moderator for the link.
Okay.
I'll put it in.
And another thing is Extinction Rebellion. I don't know whether this is a thing in the US, Prude. Have you ever heard of Extinction Rebellion?
I'm aware of it in the UK, but America's environmentalism doesn't have the same vigor as it once did in, say, the late 90s or early 2000s with Greenpeace or anti-globalization protests. But it's very much alive in the zeal of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party between the Green New Deal or the pushing from our transportation secretary about electric vehicles and our infrastructure bill. not to mention the idea of vehicle mileage taxes.
Yes, and I would say for you in the US, the really big thing, I mean, climate change, of course, is important, especially in California and such states. But I think your main issue is really social and racial justice and gender issues. And for instance,
Our biggest export.
Yes, it has not yet really arrived here in Germany in the same way that it is already practiced in the US. So, for instance, the gender pronouns. I mean, people get worked up about this. They almost get heart attacks because they aren't gendered properly. This is not that big an issue here in Europe, I would say. But climate change is really a huge issue in Germany. The Green Party was, I think, a forerunner for this. We have a very famous minister of the Green Party who introduced the Dosenpfand. I don't know how to translate this into English, but it's if you have if you drink beer and it's not a glass, but it's like this. There you have
it's called a can.
A can, yeah, a can tax. He introduced a can tax. He was the minister can tax. And we introduced it so early. And the separation, for instance, of garbage. We introduced this so early. And everybody was, well, what are those Germans doing here? And then everybody did it. So I would agree with Mono. I think you mentioned that this is a very, very big thing. And they are militant. They are really militant. So from Extinction Rebellion, you see people spray logos on the wall. People do flash mobs. I was 5 years ago or 4 years ago, I was walking about, minding my own business, and then people screaming and falling down to the floor on the open street. And like, falling down on the floor, and like, oh, we're dead because the climate has killed us. This was kind of a public flash mob, and I was like, what is this? What the heck is it?
They're also known as a die-in as well. Those mobs.
Maybe to build on Anteo's point, and this is maybe even given some flavor of what my YouTube channel is all about. They are basically, or to kind of preface this, all the parties in Germany are more or less grounded upon or aligned to an ideology, except for the Green Party, which is aligned to a religious movement. And they are basically, if you go to the very bottom of it, there are two religions in the world: the religion of the father and of the mother, the religion of heaven and the religion of earth. And of course, what happened in the old world mostly is that way back in the time of the Indo-Europeans, a culture that was aligned with the father conquered almost all other cultures which were almost exclusively aligned with the mother, and buried the motherhood religions under the earth. There are some exceptions, but that has played out again and again and again between Rome and Carthage, between the Israelites and the Canaanites, and so on and so forth. And the religion of the mother, however, has re-emerged in Europe, and it's actually been quite a while back. You can even, in my opinion, pinpoint to the exact moment where she came out of her Pandora's box, and that is the picture of the emergence of, or the birth of Venus, that we still get from the Renaissance. And since then, she has garnered strength and strength and strength in every movement that we would see as going against us. So the French Revolution, the liberal movement, so on and so forth. All these things have kind of garnered strength to revive along that religion that is now slowly taking on shape again, and it's taking shape identical to the one it had 4,000, 8,000 years ago. And of course, the supreme goddess of this religion is the Queen Mother, Mother Earth. And this is essentially what the Green Party worships, and the religion of the Green Party. This is also why there's so much hypocrisy. I mean, I'm a believing and practicing Catholic convert, and the first thing you realize when you are part of a religion that has understood itself and has been organized for 2,000 years is that everybody's a hypocrite. The only people who aren't are saints. But how many saints are there? There's like 500. How many Catholics have been there? Like 5 billion. So the same is, of course, true for the Green Party. You have a lower caste of zealots. There are some saintly figures that are able to do these feats of great resolve, which is starving yourself to death for environmental issues, stuff like that. And you have a lot of people of the, let's say, of those who don't have anywhere else to go, who are trying to imitate these zealots. And that is what you get in what Antaios just showed us. And then you have a more corrupted, a more cynical religious elite, which are the people he pointed out who are voting the Green Party, who, as Mono pointed out, are flying the jets and are generally living a high lifestyle, because in the end, the religion of the mother is all about the self. It's all about one's own pleasure and one's own understanding, and all of the let's say all of the concessions to her are only because it is understood that fertility is better than instant growth. And that is essentially how it breaks down, yeah.
Well, I think with the talk of climate change from the Green Party and its environmental focus from Merkel closing down a lot of her own plans for coal and their own domestic energy sector, I think this brings us to a good way to transition towards the foreign policy of the various parties. And one of the big topics that had been raised in chat, even before we went live on stream, was the conversation over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so I have on our shared screen here the links or the manifestos of the various parties. Their party platform is how in the US that would be decided at the national conventions. But here sort of a brief outline of what their discussions were for foreign policy and defense. And so as we talk about climate change, the Greens have been the most adamant against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in recent months and recent years. During the Trump administration, there was a lot of State Department as well as some other intelligence apparatus from the United States who were interested in the Greens and their opposition towards Nord Stream, as at the time it was for American interest to have this pipeline hopefully stopped, which that did not happen. The Biden administration in the last few months over the summer had dropped the necessary sanctions to allow the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to happen. It would have been more or less nearly completed as Biden took office, which had become a thorn in its side in regards to its position on Russia as part of American grand strategy and foreign policy. And earlier this year, at the end of June, or I believe it's at the end of June, the US and Germany had entered an agreement over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that it would more or less allow the pipeline to continue. However, Germany said that it would stop, any sort of actions from Russia if they were to use it as a political weapon or to use it as a way to bully or harass Germany and her own sovereignty, while at the same time providing a measly $1 billion towards Ukraine. Because one of the biggest issues, of course, that came out of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was that Ukraine would lose access to transitory fees of moving natural gas through pipelines that had existed there. But it's important to note that Ukraine kind of brought this upon themselves when they essentially shut down the access of Russian gas to the rest of Western Europe by simply just, an argument over transit fees and shutting down their own aspects of the pipeline. Within their own country. This was in 2008. So it had been sort of the modus operandi for Russia to do what it can to not be dependent upon Eastern European sort of former Soviet bloc states that have been positioned towards the West to ensure that one of its greatest exports, which is natural gas and other natural resources, wouldn't be inhibited by former Soviet states that have moved to the West. And of course, they've moved a lot to the West in part because of the United States, NATO, and the European Union trying to push them closer and closer towards a West-leaning alliance. I mean, Ukraine is a great example. You already had the Orange Revolution early at the beginning of in the mid-aughts. So this isn't something that is relatively new. But that's particularly the Greens having the largest objections to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Whereas Olaf Scholz of the SPD has said that they are open to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but they will abide by the agreement hammered out by Biden and Merkel over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This seems to be the middle-of-the-road approach about the pipeline and its relationship to Russia. Although, as I'm sure my guests can tell you in greater detail, that there has been a substantial drift in two key areas. One, the idea of a more defense-postured autonomy and less dependence upon the United States. We've definitely seen this by at least during the Trump administration, right? Especially as many foreign ministers were trying to reassure themselves and their chancellors that, at worst, he's here for 4 to 8 years. I mean, America will still be America afterwards. But we've seen between people like Merkel and like Emmanuel Macron out of France, a stronger push for European autonomy in its defense as well as its foreign policy. France more so, especially now after the recent agreement between the United States, Russia, Australia, and the UK over the submarine deal, which snubbed France out of a couple of $1 billion. But I think this is a great way to transition towards our last topic of the evening, which is that of foreign policy. So with that being said, gentlemen, do you have any thoughts on what we may see in the future of German foreign policy?
Nord Stream 2 is actually a very problematic issue when it comes to international and EU policies. So a member state of the EU that does not really like Nord Stream 2 at all is Poland. Poland, of course, has a very problematic history with Russia, and they see Nord Stream 1, which is already existing, which is already connecting Russia through the Baltic Sea with Germany. They see this already as a threat. And Nord Stream 2, they are totally opposed to it. And Germany, of course, with its commitment to the EU, has to find a common ground. And they also have to, maybe Ukraine is not so important, but this is also something you have to consider. And also, all the parties agree that the Minsk II agreement, which is about creating peace in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. All the German parties want that this agreement is abided by, and at the moment it's not working very well. So both Ukraine and both Russia are violating this agreement. And then you also have the transatlantic dimension, and the US is opposed to this. I know that some foreign policy hawks talk about a Mare Nostrum. A Mare Nostrum is a superstate that goes from Poland down to Romania, down to the Black Sea, as a buffer zone.
Bring back the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at that point.
In a different shape and form. But some hawks are actually talking about implementing this. And then if you look at the parties who are very favorable of Nord Stream 2, it is interesting. It is the SPD. Note that Gerhard Schröder, the former chancellor, who did his best to dismantle the welfare state in Germany from the Social Democrat SPD. He was in charge before Merkel. He called Putin a lupenreiner Demokrat, a crystal clear Democrat. Today, Schröder sits on the board of governors of Gazprom. He signed the contract for Nord Stream 1. So there you see that in the SPD, you have a very Russia-friendly faction. The AfD is all for Nord Stream 2. And the AfD has also a lot of voters among the German Russians. So the Germans who migrated from Russia back to Germany. The leftist party, I don't remember that they mentioned Nord Stream 2, but they say we have to cancel, we have to move away from this policy of aggression towards Russia. So I would assume they are also in favor of Nord Stream 2. And the CDU, yes, they say, okay, the annexation of the Crimea was against international law. They are a little more hawkish. The CDU is more on the hawkish foreign policy side of the trans-Atlanticists. But I was perplexed that so many parties are actually in favor of Nord Stream 2.
Well, I mean, considering that Germany has a wide influence on the European Union. Russia at the current moment plays a substantial role in providing energy to the European Union en masse, not just Germany. I've done a stream on it a few months back. I did a short video on it. Russia's natural gas industry provides almost 40%, if not more, of the total amount of natural gas energy of the European Union's needs. So they play a substantial role in the energy market. So this push towards Russia is partially influenced by maintaining that favorable relationship. There is this idea called trade expectation theory that the likelihood of conflict between two economically interdependent states decreases, in part because as long as you expect trade to continue on a positive note, then conflict will most likely not happen. If it goes negative, then probably not. And so with that being said, I think that I'm not surprised at all by this rather pro-Russia stance added on with a more autonomous Europe. During the Trump administration, there had been increased talks from Merkel and Macron over a autonomous European army through the European Union, which was a sort of a rebuff or a rebuke against Trump calling for NATO states to spend more of their gross domestic product on their defense, which is currently not meeting for many states the 2%, which is the agreement. But on top of this, as Anteos mentioned, Poland is a significant issue. I mean, we can only look back at the last century to see the distrust and concern over both Russia and Germany from the Polish state. During the Trump administration, there had been a movement of arms and a military base that had opened from the Americans in Poland, and the Biden administration is still maintaining that. So I would say at the very least that trying to balance your own defense autonomy, your own national interests with energy, and of course neighboring states that are EU members, of course, is going to be a tightrope to balance for any party that may have its chancellor take over in terms of a coalition government. But ST, Mono, do you have any thoughts?
Now,
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now, one of the idiosyncrasies of German foreign policy is that, like, in the German view of history, nuclear war was prevented by the German Chancellor Willy Brandt, a mixture of JFK and Obama back in the late 60s, early 70s, by essentially doing Russia's bidding, doing away with any German claims to, let's not mince words here, stolen German lands in the East, and sincerely apologizing to Poland, but don't get me started in Poland. And so since then, it's basically been a staple of German foreign policy for the SPD and generally left-leaning parties to do Russia's bidding. And since the SPD has occupied the Foreign Office in the last 2 terms, it's no surprise that Germany has been generally pro Nord Stream 2, with the CDU taking a more or less like defeatist stance on, well, we have a deal, we have to abide by the deal, and so on. Now, as has been mentioned, Nord Stream 2 is very unpopular with many other European countries, and the FDP is generally against Nord Stream as the Green Party is. And back in 2017, when the negotiations for the first Jamaica coalition happened, Macron was quoted that if the FDP takes over the Secretary of Finance, Macron, is done, because none of his plans to reform the Eurozone can be done. So adopting the French position on Nord Stream 2 is one of the easiest ways for the FDP and for the Green Party, frankly, to do something, quote-unquote, pro-European without it costing them anything at all.
You muted yourself.
And as we're talking about the transatlantic implications of Nord Stream 2, I would like to mention NATO and the US nuclear weapons that are in Germany. Now, Germany is very anti-atomic energy. Mind that, we are phasing out our nuclear plants 1 year from now. And there are still nuclear weapons in Germany by the US. And most parties want to get rid of them. I think it's only the FDP and the CDU who are actually in favor of keeping the nuclear weapons. I mean, you need to take into account that I'm talking about the political manifestos. So the political manifestos will cater to their base. The political manifestos are more about what the parties think that their base wants them to do. It also reflects the ideology of the party, but this you have to take into account. And I think although many parties are against US nuclear weapons in Germany, it will not happen, because here you have international globalist interests, you have the deep state, and I don't think this will happen. But when we talk about NATO, for instance, I mean, there's a party, for instance, the leftist party, they want to leave NATO. The Green Party, they don't want to abide by the 2% goal, so that you commit 2% of your GDP to the defense budget. The SPD says, yes, NATO is very good and we need to be a member, but they don't mention the 2% goal, which means that they don't support it. And it's really only the AfD and the CDU, and maybe a little bit the FDP, who take a more hawkish stance on defense, in that they want to expand the German Bundeswehr, the German army, and in that they want to abide by the 2% goal.
Okay, before I give my take, I just want to say, Antaios, that cigarette gave you real aristocrat vibes. I dig it. Although smoking is bad for you, people don't do it. But other than that, I think to understand Germany's foreign policy, we first have to do a very small history lesson, and that is, of course, that Germany as a construct, as we see it today, was a construct by the US as a satellite state against the USSR. Of course, we were famously one of the big borders, one of the big places of conflict in the Cold War. And this has been so enormous, so important for this country, that you can essentially say that Germany, as it stands today, has nothing in common with anything, or very little in common with anything that has been on this soil before. So not the Third Reich, certainly, but also not the Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, or even the Bavarian civilization. That said, or this is something that many Germans don't know, but those who are politically, let's say, educated, and those who are in the parties tend to be more politically educated, do know that and do understand Germany as essentially a satellite state that is slowly starting to take shape on its own, as it is in a very fortunate position. And that fortunate position is the second biggest part of German foreign policy, and that is, of course, that the Eurozone has a common currency. So a common currency means that where you would normally have a matching between countries that is done by currency appreciation and depreciation, we have one that is done by competence appreciation and depreciation. So, for example, in a traditional model, Germany and, let's say, Poland have different and non-linked currencies. That means that if Germany produces all the cars and Poland produces basically nothing, that Germany, the German mark, I guess in that case, would appreciate against the Polish zloty, and that means that to Germans, Polish good would be cheaper, and to Polish German goods would be more expensive, and that way international trade would kind of resume at a new equilibrium. But if currencies tie together, as they are between most European member states, this is not the case anymore. This is also why Germany is such an export-heavy country, because our currency, of course, is held artificially low by the European Union. This is also why Euroscepticism is a very weak and very unpopular position in Germany, and one of the biggest killers to the AfD, because the AfD is, of course, Germany's only major Eurosceptic party, which is, of course, justified on, let's say, cultural grounds, because the culture that is currently pushed and held by the European Union is one that further erodes any kind of domestic spirit, family orientation, or anything good in the world. But other than that, the Eurozone is something that Germany benefits the most out of any country. And that is, of course, because since we have linked currencies, the currency exchange doesn't happen. So one, we get to export cheaper, and two, this equilibrium now takes place in the form of competence exchange. That means that Germany's least competent are supposed to leave the country, which doesn't happen, but our exchange or trade partners most competent do enter our country, which is the other side of competence exchange. This means that certain cities in Germany, namely Frankfurt and Hamburg, but also to a large degree Munich, are becoming international globalist hubs of trade and commerce, which is another reason why trade and commerce-oriented parties like the FDP are so popular, and why the Greens have this kind of double identity with actually being a very champagne socialist party. What all of this amounts to in terms of a foreign policy is that we are deeply linked to the European Union, and that in the European Union at the same time, there has to be a race for leadership, because only one country can take on this, let's say, center of gravity for European exchange and trade. This is something that happens that in every union that has common currency. It also happened in the United States. In the United States, the clear winner are what you call the coastal regions, states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, etc., which are getting richer and richer and richer at the exchange or at the offset of what you call flyover states, who are having their wealth sucked out of them by the invisible hand of the market, more or less, and as such have no standing to complain. In Europe, people more or less know this, and the only real frontrunners are France and Germany, which are both in a race to establish as many satellite states within and outside of the Union. Candidates are countries like Greece and Spain for Germany. For France, it's also a lot of countries in the Western African region, where, of course, I think France has carried out over 50 political assassinations ever since they have left, or have claimed to have left, their colonial ambitions behind, to kind of get more money and more leverage into the country. At the end, one of the countries has to lever out the other ones, and as soon as the other one breaks, that country takes over complete control of the European Union. For that reason, of course, people want to be good with the major powers. And so Germany and France are both in talks with the three big players in the world right now, China, Russia, and the United States, and are kind of trying to backhandedly dish it out against one another. And for that reason, we finally come to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, the Nord Stream pipelines, which of course would put Germany into a prime position of both having cheap access to energy resources, as well as possibly being an exporter of energy resources to other European countries, so more transforming into an energy hub, depending on how much volume they can trade through the pipeline and how much or how they can trade it further, so on and so forth. Then Germany has the other kind of consideration here is that we understand ourselves to be a satellite state of the United States, but we have the ambition of breaking free from that, of potentially taking over Europe and becoming a central power or a great power alongside what we at the moment perceive to be the great powers of America, Russia, and China. To that end, of course, we have to, let's say, keep Russia at bay a bit, and there are a lot of considerations about what is Russia's future, similarly to considerations about what is China's future, because the ambition to unite the EU and to consolidate it into one potentially world-leading superpower is, of course, what is at stake and what is aimed or what is maneuvered to by both Germany and France in various ways and various means. And the only people who are kind of completely outside of that equation are the AfD and the Green Party. The AfD because both of these are more ideological parties. The AfD, of course, because it is mostly engaged in cultural issues, but because Russia is seen as an ally in cultural issues, they are in favor of everything pro-Russian. And as Antaios also mentioned, they have a lot of German-Russian diaspora amongst their ranks. So they, of course, support it. And the Green Party, who are ideologues who will just go with whatever their ideology dictates instead of doing any kind of political considerations or calculations.
And and when you mentioned China there, both the various the CDU, the SPD, FDP, and even the Greens have had language in their party platforms and as well as from their party leadership that is very similar to what Biden has been saying about China and what mainstream Democrats in the United States have talked about China, which has been the idea of viewing China as, a partner, not necessarily a rival, but an economic competitor in which it was, important to work with. Although recently, the German destroyer, the Bayer, had been turned away from a Chinese port. They were denied access from the Chinese to port and, resupply and get their men off board. I know that Germany does have international ambitions when it comes to the Chinese. They are far more distant from the transatlantic position of, say, the United Kingdom or the United States, which at this point I should really say is more of the Anglosphere in the continent in comparison to their foreign policies. While France has been snubbed by the AUKUS agreement, when we take a look at some of the other politics about the great powers in the region, Germany has been far more forthcoming with the idea of working with great powers rather than viewing them as rivals like the United States does, whether it is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia and its energy exports and leveraging a greater diplomatic relationship while still towing the line on the NATO rhetoric about the Crimean Peninsula and the war going on in the Donbass region. But secondly is also the concern of, with China, 5G and Huawei, while the Anglosphere has been more adamant about resisting it, the United States, the UK, they even got Brazil, of all countries, to also reject it. Germany has been a little more open to integration with Chinese telecom companies and working with them. In the same way that they kind of work around, similar to how France works around American sanctions about engaging with Iran, for example. This is in Germany, but France has a lot of its airline industry. I believe a good chunk of its manufacturing also is assisted by production in Iran, a lifeblood to the Iranian economy. They try their best to skirt American sanctions there. But ST brings up a good point that there is that perspective about engaging with other powers rather than necessarily taking the standard transatlantic, i.e. American position about viewing them as rivals. Although I'm trying my hardest not to bring up Peter Hitchens' lecture about the EU being organized Germanism when you mention what influence Germany has. But there is a great book by George Friedman that I've discussed on stream talking about the Franco-German rivalry and how that might cause issues for the European Union. It's called Flashpoints, the Emerging Crisis in Europe. You should definitely give it a read. But it is a significant departure from sort of the standard bearer hold the transatlantic position, where we're seeing a push for a more autonomous Germany and by an extension a more autonomous European Union from the olden American-centric transatlantic alliance. And I think that would be a good way to finish off our conversation here. Mono, I know that you had some thoughts there.
Now, within the CDU, there have been two rivaling perspectives on foreign policy, one being staunchly pro-Europe and one being also pro-Europe but more for the transatlantic partnership, with, of course, the hardline pro-Europe view being generally dominant. I think it's a bit of an interesting question who would get the Foreign Office. I think two of the more likely candidates are Norbert Röttgen of the CDU and Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, a true nobleman, by the way, of the FDP, who would both lean more for the transatlantic partnership direction and who, when on TV, will always go on about how bad it is that the partnership has been so difficult, Trump bad, and so on. So I do think that we will not see a radical push for more European integration or a more sovereign Europe, even though all mainstream parties in question are pro-Europe. However, German foreign policy is very held back, very, very, very slow. I mean, most German corporations, car manufacturers, are of course pro-China because China is an important market for German cars. So it's difficult to see Germany doing or joining in anything that is remotely anti-Chinese. So I can't really see German foreign policy being a big factor of interest. And of course, extensively, SD has been talking about the euro. The euro could be in grave danger, depending on how the next Italian election and, of course, the French election next year goes. So I would guess that German foreign policy will be mostly like stable, a continuation of the status quo until the autumn of 2022, when the French are voting.
Yeah, don't expect a hawkish take of Germany on China. So the trade between Germany and China is 212 billion euros, and the German exports were 95 billion, and Chinese imports were 116 billion. So it's more or less equal. So here we have a symbiotic relationship, whereas in the US it's quite different. You get a lot of criticism of the situation for the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and everything. But in the end, this is just talk. China does in their country whatever they want to do, and we can criticize it. And I just wanted to mention one comment that somebody made. I think Spanish Groipa, and he said that the SPD and the Greens are pushing the Great Replacement. So this is another argument I make why the Greens are so ideological. Because if you think about it, it's not really in the best interest of Germany, but they will still push it. Like they've pushed the phasing out of nuclear energy and of coal. So the Green Party, they are really ambitious. They are really ideological. And you see this when you read their political manifestos. They are the only ones with new ideas. The SPD, the CDU, blah, 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 yada, yada. The Greens, they come up with the new ideas. For instance, they want to create immigration centers, asylum centers, run by the EU all over Africa and Asia. So in Uganda, in Lebanon, in Pakistan. And you can walk in and you can say, I'm an asylum seeker. They want to declare Turkey a unsicheres Herkunftsland, a country of origin that is not safe. Now, according to the German asylum law, this means that if a country is unsafe, you can apply for asylum, because Turkey has a lot of Kurds, and the Kurds, they have a hard time. But the idea is because Turkey is in the NATO, that it's a safe harbor, it's a safe country. But the Greens, they want to say no, it's not. And the Greens, so if you come here as an asylum seeker, you can bring your family, your core family, children, and partner. But the Greens, they want to say, all right, we will include siblings. So my idea is how this would work like this. So you come from Turkey, you're a Kurd, you're Kurdish. You come there, you bring your 10 sisters. These sisters have children and husbands. They also come. They in turn have sisters and kids. And this sounds like a never-ending story. But this is something that the Greens are proposing, and they're also proposing to reorganize the UN Security Council. They want to give more seats to southern states, African states, Latin American states. And now here comes the really big thing. They want to make the UN more democratic. They want to give the right to start a peacekeeping operation according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. They want to delegate this right from the Security Council to the General Assembly. They have not thought out what that means. And here you see why they are ideologues. The Green Party, like all parties, except the AfD and the Linke. They write in their manifesto, Israel's right to existence is the Staatsräson of Germany, the national interest. But what will happen if you give the General Assembly the right to institute peacekeeping measures? we had a lot of resolutions by the UN Security Council damning, criticizing the actions of Israel. Yes, so this is my take on the Green Party.
Well, I'm going to take a look real quick at what the latest news has been from the Politico EU blog here about what they've been saying. And I think as we hit the 2-hour mark, that'd be a very good way to push it forward towards the conclusion of our stream and get towards shilling. But let's see here. Let's take a look. The German newspaper TASS has opted to open tomorrow's online paper with one of the few things that are clear after tonight's results. It's a boy, the paper added, and that after 16 years of Merkel, a man will become chancellor again. Kind of a funny there thing with the paper. But we
This
talked
is
earlier...
like
Oh, go
the
ahead.
Taz is one of the worst newspapers you can imagine in Germany. It's like The Guardian, but if The Guardian stopped trying to appeal to a mainstream audience. It's a cesspool.
So like the National Enquirer here in the US or something like that.
The Taz is the mouthpiece of the Green Party.
Okay. The other thing that came up was when we discussed earlier about first-time voters was the generation gap. While young voters under the age of 25 are more likely to cast their vote for the Greens or the FDP, older voters prefer the traditional big tent parties of the SDP and CDU, according to a survey from the public broadcaster ARD. Among voters aged 70 and older, nearly 40% voted for the CDU and 33% voted for the SPD. So none of this, like we talked about earlier, is particularly surprising. There's always been a generational gap when it comes to sort of the younger, more fringe parties. I guess that youthful idealism compared to the big tent engaged in the traditional form of politics with the older individuals. But with that being said, I'm going to change the image real quick so people can see the live results because someone was asking for it, and I think that's a good question. So let me change the screen sharing here, and we'll get the live results as soon as I can. Not much has changed from the last time I was showing them based on the polling, or based on the exit polls, but let me load it up for you all. Share screen. Chrome tab. There we go, share. So this is what we're getting right now that gets updated every few minutes or so from Politico's European branch. And right now it seems that the SPD have a much larger portion than they have from their 2017 results. So this is the top larger thick one that we see of their share of parliament is the 2021 result, and the one below it, the smaller arc, is the 2017. But yeah, this is where we're currently at with the state of the election. And of course, I'm sure that it'll take time to count in mail-in ballots and to get everything situated for final results. So this is all just more of a very live reaction and a very much rank punditry, which we typically don't do on this channel. But I'm very thankful for our guests for coming on to discuss it and to give a perspective from the fatherland about the election, how it operates, and everything. So with that being said, gentlemen in the chat and my wonderful guests, I'm going to move towards the end of our show here, but with that being said, the three of you, final thoughts so far as we get the results pouring in and what the future might be for your respective country.
Maybe I start. And this is something I'm actually, when I finished my bachelor's thesis, which I'm currently working on, and which is why I'm very grateful that we only did 2 hours. But I will get a video out about strength, about power. And one of the things I will talk about there more, and that I want to mention now, is you guys might know the etymology of the word losing. Prudentialist as the residential Anglo. Do you know the what it connects to other words, to which other words it connects to?
I can't say that I do.
Okay. Loosening, for example, which is the reason for that is very simple. If you have two armies that are going against one another, the one that breaks up first is the one that is going to be defeated in the end, or is likely going to be defeated in the end. And so what losing really means, loosening, and of course in Germany we now see the loosening up. As Antaios mentioned a while ago, we used to have 3 parties, the CDU, CSU, the SPD, and the FDP. And now we have 6, and it's going to increase, and it's going to increase. Germany's fractured more and more, and I think that is where we're headed. We have kind of achieved the spear point of pushing ourselves forward on burning what was behind us, and now we have nothing to stand on anymore. And this is now the inevitable break of the country, which will result sadly in it going away if it isn't being saved. And of course, as a real right winger, as a person who is more in favor of what Europe used to be than what it was, this might seem like a good thing, because of course Europe right now is very much antagonistic to what it used to be. But we always have to remember that it's not funny being a failed state, and that if we don't watch out, that is very well a possibility for this country. And so it is a more bleak look into the future of Germany.
Mono?
Well, first of all, I can agree to generally everything that has been said. I mean, we do see the fragmentation, but also the parties are more hollowed out. The SPD, for example, you could read newspaper articles about them from like 4 or 5 years ago about how they have hardly anyone left who is considered an expert on foreign policy, and the situation hasn't gotten any better. So the situation has been accelerating. I think the status quo for the past few years has been managed decline with a constant flirting with free fall, and that will probably continue unless, like, the coalition between the SPD, the Green Party, and the far left will sneak through a majority. Then the free fall could come relatively quickly. There have been some allusions some alluding to fortifications and some of that stuff in Germany, and I just want to say regarding this, there is really no need for the powers that be to do anything like that. I mean, what is the worst realistic outcome for them? A centrist coalition headed by the CDU. I mean, what we saw last November was really like the nuclear option. That was not necessary probably for Goldwater. That was not necessary in that shape or form for the Ron Paul campaigns in the last few election cycles. So I really don't see why the powers that be should even risk trying to fortify this election. I mean, this is a pretty good result for them, hands down.
I stick with what I've said before. I think we will see a grand coalition between the Social Democrat SPD and the CDU, now under the rule not of Mutti Merkel, but of Papi Scholz, Father Scholz. The other coalitions that we're talking about involving the Green Party and the FDP, I think it is unlikely because these parties are ideologically too opposed. If it would happen, I think it would actually be a good thing, because the parties would destroy each other while in coalition, and the opposition would gain strength. And with that being said, Prude, thanks for having me on. It was great fun.
Well, we're not done just yet. Anateos, you're new to this channel and stream, so you get to see how things conclude around here, so don't worry. I'm going to give you all three a chance to shill in just a second, but as I can't really say long-time viewers, as I've only been doing this for a year, but as long-time viewers will know, I like to conclude our streams when they are typically dour in topics or it's a lengthy lecture on theory. I try my best to make it a little lighthearted, so as we get to the end, you'll see why it's so fun. I have a lovely thing to make it lighthearted. So let me share my screen here real quick, and let me present. So I'll just start off with announcements and the usual housekeeping at the end here. I will have a video out this Thursday, which is the 30th, and a Substack post on Friday. The video will just be a reading of the September 11th Substack post, because I know there's not enough crossover between the Substack subscribers and the subscribers here on YouTube. So you guys will get a reading of that. I'm just marking the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and my perspective. And then the Substack post on Friday the 1st will be about tradition in the ashes, just some thoughts I had on Mr. Turnip's great video on Generation Z. After that, and I'll be testing out next weekend the tripod and getting some real talk in for a fishing video. And then next Sunday stream, which will be October the 3rd, maybe a patron-backed stream on Japan, or it'll be a discussion on alliances. It'll be the 1-year anniversary of the channel, so I'm excited to celebrate that all with you. But on Teos is what we normally do at the end of the stream here, as you can tell by maybe the chat with all of the lovely frog emojis on here, is that I end things with a various frog of the week, just a different species with some fun facts at the end. Try to keep it lighthearted. And so with that being said, prep your ears and hopefully the music will play rightly this time. So here we go. Oh no! There we go. Okay, so if anyone's a fan of Chrono Trigger, you might recognize where that's from. But so I figured today that we would have a European frog on, one that can be found in Germany, and it is the yellow-bellied toad, and it is a resident of the Balkans, southern France, southern Germany, and Switzerland. It's within the genus of the fire-bellied toads. Its mating season ranges from late spring to late August, so hopefully they've already managed to have their children by now. And like the name implies, they are known for their bright yellow or orange patches under their bellies, their underarms, and fingers. They have a rounded snout with a set of romantic eyes. I don't know if you can tell in this picture, but their pupils, the black in their eyes, are in the shape of a heart. So they have a romantic set of eyes when they look upon you or whoever else. They're a sexually dimorphic species like most amphibians, but the males have a longer femur bone, which allows them to give the necessary strength to either engage in amplexus mating or to fight off other males. So they're the males are the fighting men of the species, while the females are typically larger than the males. The men are prepared to fight for their territory, their spawn, or for their women. And their women, of course, can hatch a high number of eggs, anywhere between 45 to 100, but they average usually around 75. And after their eggs are hatched, they come out very quickly within 3 to 4 days. And they're a small one, usually about 2 inches in length. And again, with the music, as Cyberpunk Internal Affairs is in chat, he is a good friend of mine. He's the one who did this theme, and I thank him for it. And he has his own channel, so you should go check him out. But yeah, that's this week's Frog of the Week, the yellow-bellied toad. So now we're on to the end, and I would like my guests, if you have anything that you would like to shill or to let people know what you do, by all means. We'll start with ST. What would you like to shill for us today before you get back to work on your thesis?
Thank you. Yeah, I would absolutely share my YouTube channel, Structured Thoughts. Watch it and find out why I call myself Structured Thoughts, why I have the goal to claim that name, and see if you agree or not. I technically have a Twitter, which I use to mostly repost the Pope and other Catholics. And sometimes I put comics on there I draw, which are more, let's say, they don't get the best reception, mostly because they're very unintelligible for most people, I think. But if you want
abstract.
Very abstract, yeah. You can find me on Twitter under Structured Though one, but that is the one that I don't put much effort into. All my effort goes into my YouTube channel, or all the effort that I do publicly on the internet. Definitely follow me or check me out there and see whether you like it or not. Thank you. And thank you for having me on, Prude.
Oh yeah, and his YouTube channel is linked in the description. Mono, do you have anything that you want to shill or talk about?
Well, yes, in the description is my Twitter page linked. I would be very flattered if you followed me there. I'm relatively new to Twitter, only joined last December. I'm not terribly active on Twitter, which is like a vicious cycle of lack of audience, which leads to little posting on my term, which would not generate an audience, yada, yada, yada. But that means that there's little risk connected to following me on Twitter, so feel free to do so. And of course, thank you, Prudentialist, for having me on.
Well, thank you for joining us. And his Twitter is linked in the description. And then on Teos, by all means, shill away.
Yes, check out my Odyssey channel. The link is in the show notes. I do videos on history. The last video was on the Illuminati, where I talk with Semigog about this issue. And I make the case that the Illuminati, they were founded in 1776 and they were outlawed in 1785. and then they cease to exist, but they continue to exist in our imagination. If you have a different opinion, I would like you to check out this video and tell me why the Illuminati still exist. And another thing that I would like to show is Odyssey. It's much better than BitChute. It is becoming a YouTube killer. It has a very good user experience, and it is powered by decentralized blockchain and by the cryptocurrency LBC, with which you can send super chats. So no investment advice, just go check it out. Do your due diligence.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming on. As usually, you'll hear from me when it comes to things like this. The usual shilling, of course, is just the announcements about what I have coming up, which we've talked about. But if you're interested in supporting the channel and you don't want Google taking up a good chunk of your money, there is always the Subscribe Star link in the description. That, of course, all goes towards taking care of my anti-rejection medication and things like that. You guys make that all possible, which I'm very thankful for. I don't really have to dip into my own real life salary and such about it, which I'm thankful. You guys make that very awesome, and I'm very appreciative of it. So the Subscribe Star link is in the description. And of course, there is YouTube channel memberships if you're interested in that. And of course, the super chat option, which we got one earlier today from Robert Walsh for $5 Canadian. And he says, the German frog. That's his message, which of course, when he watches this later, since he wasn't in the chat, he'll have the opportunity to see a German resident frog at the end of the stream. But yeah, with all that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end. And I think that it's a great way to just say that the German election is brand new. We're talking about it on the day of the election, so there's still a lot of news that'll come out in the future. But you've heard our thoughts, you've heard our takes, and what is to come and what is to happen next. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very good evening, a good afternoon, or good morning if you're on the other side of the world. And I'll see you all next time. Be prudent, everybody.